this is a beefy integrated amp. So what you're looking at is the Yamaha A-S1200. Not only is it one of the latest high-end audio components from Yamaha, it also serves as the entry point into their high-end integrated amplifier portfolio. So just to give you a general overview as to what you're looking at, the 1200 is a Class AB integrated amplifier that'll output 90 watts into 8 ohms and 150 watts into 4 ohms. It has an old school look with old school build quality. It weighs 48 pounds, but this doesn't come cheap. It carries a price tag of $2,799.95. But you know what? We're just going to round up and call it $2,800 from this point onwards. Now, as with all of my reviews, first we're going to quickly go over the features that you get with the 1200. We're going to take a look at the front of the unit, at the back, then we're going to take a peek under the hood and check out the internal components before I finally talk about how it performs. So, getting started, let's go over the features starting from left to right. So on the very left, we have our power switch, and when you hit it, it makes a very satisfying sound. Let's check it out. And this will illuminate these beautiful VU meters. Now next to that, we are going to have a headphone jack. This is going to be a 1/4 jack, and this is just a convenience feature. It doesn't come with a dedicated headphone amplifier. That's going to be for the higher end model. Next to that, we are going to have our speaker selector switch. We have A, B, A+B with bi-wiring capabilities. Next, we have a switch for a meter. Right now it's set to peak, so this is going to be for our VU meter. So if you want to see instantaneous dynamic current, you leave it as is. If you want to switch it to VU mode, that's going to represent more of what we hear when the unit's outputting sound. And then we have a dimmer. This is cool. So let's just say you don't want the lights in your face while you listen. Hit dimmer and you're going to notice the lights are going to gradually go down, turn off, and then they're eventually going to turn back on again. So that's a nice feature to have. And to stop it, just hit switch again. We have tone controls for bass and treble. Now I don't know what frequency they attenuate at the moment. Once I get that information, I'll leave it down in the description box below. Next to that, we have our left to right balance control. Now this is going to be useful for those of you who are working with less than optimal conditions, because sometimes you can't put the speakers exactly where they're going to sound the best, and sometimes the right channel may be more dominant than, say, the left. So this is a good way to get good balance in less than perfect situations. Next to that, we have our input selector knob. We have our volume control on the very right, and then beneath that, we have our auto mute switch. So when you hit that, that'll take the sound down 20 dB. So that's going to be it for the front of the unit. Now let's take a look at the back. Actually, before we look at the back, let's just take a quick moment to appreciate the beautiful piano gloss side panel. It just looks so good. Also, I forgot to mention that, yes, it does come with a remote control, which, as you can tell, I still actually have the plastic around it. Anyways, now let's look at the back. Okay, so here's the back of the 1200. So let's quickly go over the features starting from left to right. On the very left, we have a set of high quality brass speaker terminals. And while the 1200 can technically power 2 speakers at the same time, it's important to note that it can only safely do so if both speakers have a minimum impedance of 8 ohms or higher. You can also bi-wire directly from the 1200. Next to that, we have a number of different brass RCA inputs. We have an input for a tuner, CD player, just a general aux in. And then beneath that, we have a built-in phono preamplifier. So apparently, this phono preamplifier is really good, but I had no way to test it in the review. But still, it's nice to know you have a moving magnet and moving coil option. Next to that, we have line in and line out. So this is going to be for tape decks, CD recorders, things like that. Next to that, we are going to have a pre-out. So if you want to run a subwoofer and or a separate amplifier, you have the option to do so. We also have a main in case you want to use the 1200 as just an amplifier. Next to that, of course, we have another set of speaker terminals. We have our auto power standby feature. So after 8 hours of non-use, the amplifier will shut down if you leave that on. Next to that's going to be some IR triggers for home automation use, and then we have the IEC inlet on the bottom. Now you're going to notice there's no ground here, and that's because this is a floated design. So anyways, that is it for the back of the unit. So now let's pop the hood and take a look at what's underneath. Okay, so here's the inside of the 1200. And I gotta say, when you're spending thousands of dollars on an integrated amplifier, this is exactly what you want to see when you pop the hood. A bunch of high quality internal parts. So let's get this started by first going over the bar that you see across the top of the chassis. This bar serves 2 primary functions. Number 1 is to help provide the case with better structural rigidity, and then number 2 is designed to help dampen the top cover piece. Now I already unscrewed the bar, that way I can take it off so we can look at the good stuff. Now, a quick overview of the 1200. Once again, this is a Class AB integrated amplifier that outputs 90 watts into 8 ohms and 150 watts into 4 ohms. So now let's take a closer look at what you get. You will notice these large heat sinks that will be perfectly adequate for thermal regulation. And then you're going to notice this toroidal transformer. So one of the key differences between the 1100 and the 1200 is that the 1100 uses an EI transformer, whereas the new 1200 uses a large 625 volt amp toroidal transformer. Next to that, we have some big capacitors. These are going to be our filter caps that'll give you 72,000 microfarads of filter capacitance. In between them, we're going to have this rubber piece that's designed to help dampen them. In fact, Yamaha is very big on eliminating resonances within the chassis. According to them, the circuit that they use hinges on low vibration. So you're going to notice fine touches like brass bushings that will secure the transformer plate to the rest of the chassis. Now, one of the interesting things about the 1200 is that you can't really see the transistors, but most Class AB amplifiers rely on a typical push-pull configuration, but the 1200 relies on something called a pull-pull configuration. Now, I'm not going to pretend to know exactly what's going on there, but Yamaha does have some information available on their website, just in case you're curious to learn more. Another thing that I find interesting about the 1200 is that a lot of integrated amplifiers will use passive preamplifiers to control the volume, but the preamplifier on the 1200 uses a lot of active components. A nice touch. Another nice touch is the use of high quality parts. You're going to see Nichicon capacitors all over the place. Even the filter caps are pretty high quality. These are Nippon capacitors. And the funny thing is, when you look at Yamaha's website, they call them chemical capacitors, which is almost like saying capacitor. I don't know. I just thought that was funny and worth pointing out. So this is going to be the general overview of the 1200. The only other thing I need to mention is that another critical change of the 1200 over the 1100 is that they altered the voicing of the unit. And that leads me to how it actually performs. Okay, so before I talk about the performance, I need to address one thing real quick. You see, I know at least some of you who are tuning into this video right now are hoping that I'm going to comment on how the outgoing 1100 compares to the new 1200. And unfortunately, I'm not going to be the person that can provide that information for you. The reason being is, while I have heard the 1100, I haven't spent enough time with it to comment on its performance with any kind of confidence. So instead, all I'm going to do is talk about how the 1200 performs as is. So getting right to that, the 1200 is an integrated amplifier that has a very distinct sound. In fact, it's so distinct, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time describing it. So overall, you can summarize this presentation using just two words. Those two words being presence and clarity. Because when you listen to the 1200, it's clear that this amplifier is all about projecting the sound in a forward way. It has this muscular confidence to it that's all about big dynamic output, clarity, and giving the music a sense of immediacy and scale. So let's talk about the character in a little bit more detail. It's interesting because when you listen to the overall character of the 1200, it is for the most part fairly neutral. For example, the bass. The bass is clean, it's articulate, it actually has good tone to it, but there's this power there. But the power only really reveals itself when recording demands it. But when the recording demands it, my God, the 1200 has quite a bit of visceral bass. And you're going to notice this especially if you pair it up to larger speakers. But moving on, we have the mid-range. The mid-range, a lot like the bass, is very even-keeled. It's very clear, open sounding, has good tone to it. It's not warm, but it's also not thin or dry either. It's just more matter of fact. However, where the coloration for the 1200 really comes in is in the upper mid-range and lower treble. This is where you're going to find a large, I would say a fairly large bump into frequency response, and this is what's responsible for all the attributes that I just mentioned, that forwardness, that clarity, that sense of immediacy and scale. I mean, that's exactly where it comes from. And this makes the 1200 something of a polarizing integrated amplifier, because I think there's some people that are going to love that sound and others not so much. Now, I feel like the presentation is just a little too aggressive, but here's the cool thing. That's what tone controls are for, because as soon as I take the treble and I adjust it downwards just a little bit, that is where I feel like the presentation is awesome. It's not too aggressive, but it still maintains that decent immediacy and that character. That's where I think the 1200 really shines. But again, you can tune it to taste. Otherwise though, guys, it's a very solid integrated amplifier. The noise floor is pretty darn low, so you can pair it up to efficient speakers with no problems. The dynamic output is very good. For a 90 watt amplifier, it definitely has quite a bit of cojones to the sound. It's a very clean sounding amplifier, but speaking of cojones, it also has decent punch. So if you listen to rock and roll music, I mean, it definitely has that kind of muscular, almost rock and roll sound, especially when the music calls for it. Otherwise, it seems to be just a well-rounded, powerful amp with a very distinct character, but it's definitely ready to have some fun. Anyways, that's going to be my take on the sound. So now let's go over some of the things you can do to really maximize the performance of it. Okay, so I may have misworded my outro because I don't really have any tips for you all so much as I do points to consider. So first, let's talk about heat. Overall, the 1200 runs fairly cool, even after hours of operation. So this is going to be great news for those of you who plan on putting it in something of a cramped space. But I do have to say, even though it runs efficient like any high quality amplifier, it needs a little bit of room to breathe for safe operation. So I would say give it a good 2 to 3 inches on every side in order for air to circulate through the chassis. Next, let's talk about power. Yes, this is a powerful integrated amplifier. It's overbuilt, but for those of you who like to listen at 95 or 100 dB listening levels or beyond, you're going to want to pair it up to fairly sensitive speakers in order to cleanly achieve those volume levels. So I'm talking about something that's probably between 89 to 90 dB sensitive. It can still be a forum load, but the sensitivity needs to be fairly high. And lastly, let's talk about speaker matching. So normally I have advice for you all on the kind of products that should pair up best to a product, but not this time around. And that's because the 1200 has such a distinct sound that you're either going to love it or not so much, regardless of what you own. So let me give you an example. If you pair up the 1200 that has this forward and present presentation along with something that also has a similar type of sound, like say a lot of speakers from B&W, Focal, or Kef, it's just going to double down on that virtue. So for those of you who love that, you're going to get a very live, you are there listening experience. And this holds especially true for those of you who own like Klipsch heritage products. Oh my gosh. But the opposite is also true for warm sounding speakers. If you have something that you feel needs a little bit more life, then this could be a very good pairing to them. So this is something where you just have to try it for yourself to see where you land. Someone like myself, I'm just not going to be able to tell you for sure what's going to work best with something like the 1200. So now let's talk about some of the caveats. Okay, so when it comes to caveats, let's just go ahead and get the obvious out of the way. Number one, does the 1200 come with every single convenience feature that a lot of people want in 2020, like USB input and built-in streaming capability? No. But then again, it's not really a caveat because that's not what Yamaha was going for. I mean, this is modeled after the old school idea of sound quality first. And if you want all those additional things, then you buy it separately. Obviously, for some people, that's a deal killer, but for those of you who know what you're getting into, it shouldn't be a problem. Moving on, I think a legitimate complaint is that the headphone output of this amplifier is just bad, straight up bad. It's among the worst I've heard with an integrated amplifier in this class. It's very bright, just very unrefined, and barely listenable, in my opinion. Moving on though, and I think this is going to be the main thing, is that, look, it has a very distinct sound. It is on the forward side of neutral. It does have a very energetic and immediate presentation. Look, it's not going to be the most refined or sophisticated sounding integrated amp for the money, but for those of you who like that type of a presentation, it's definitely not going to be a problem for you. So anyways, guys, that's pretty much going to be it for the caveats, so let's wrap this whole thing up. So all in all, I like the 1200. I mean, look, it's a big, overbuilt, old-school looking integrated amplifier with an energetic yet clean sound. Now, I admit at first I wasn't too keen on it, but after I got used to the presentation, I admit I like its rather unpretentious and almost rock and roll muscular sound behind it. Now, if you're somebody who thinks you would like something like this, and you want something that should last a very long time, I definitely encourage you to check it out. I know that so long as I turn the treble down just a little bit, I mean, this is something I could live with for a very long time for my own self. Anyways, guys, that's going to be my final take on the Yamaha AS1200. If you're into comparisons, stick around. And if this is the end of the line for you, then thanks for watching. And until next time, peace. Okay, since I know how much you guys like comparisons, what I'm going to do to wrap up this video is talk about how the Yamaha stacks up to something else within the same general price range, which in this case is going to be the Parasound Halo Hint 6 integrated amplifier. So this is the game plan. Since both integrated amplifiers have a lot of features and I don't have enough time to go over all of them, instead I'm just going to give you a superficial overview as to what you get on the front of both units, then I'm going to take a look at the internal components, and then I'm going to talk about how they compare to one another in terms of raw performance. So let's get right to it. So the Yamaha, as you guys can tell, takes on more of that old school vibe as accented with the front VU meters, whereas the Parasound Halo Hint 6 has more of that clean aesthetic going on. So now looking to the front of both units, both of them use a nice solid metal piece, but I gotta say, the Yamaha offers more metal componentry. The selector switch, tone controls, the input knob, the volume control, all of those components are metal, whereas on the Parasound, most of them are going to be plastic, except for the volume control, that's going to be metal. But I gotta say, I do like the digital volume meter on the Parasound, which you can't see right now because it's powered off. So now let's look at the internal components. So, as a refresher, the Yamaha is a Class AB integrated amplifier that'll output 90 watts into 8 ohms, whereas the Parasound is also a Class AB amplifier, but it'll output 160 watts into 8 ohms. But when you look at them, it highlights the differences in approach to engineering a component at this price range. For example, what Yamaha is going for is something that is overbuilt. As you can tell with the oversized heat sinks here, which are much larger than the higher power Parasound. And don't get me wrong, the heat sinking here is adequate. In fact, the heat sinks are taller than what you may realize due to the camera not being able to show it off. But still, the Yamaha's heat sinks are larger. Now, let's talk about the differences in the transformers. So the Yamaha uses a 625 volt amp toroidal transformer, whereas the Parasound uses a 1 kilovolt amp transformer, toroidal transformer that is shielded. So this is a pretty big difference. Now, looking at the filter capacitance bank, the Yamaha actually has more, 72,000 microfarads against Parasound's 40,000 microfarads. Beyond that, we have how they treat the preamp section. So the preamp section on the Yamaha has more in common with an active preamp, whereas the Parasound has more of a passive preamplifier thing going on. Also, Yamaha pays a little bit more attention to eliminating resonance within the chassis. In fact, that's a big thing for them, but it's not to say that Parasound doesn't. In fact, even though they don't advertise it, when you press down on the boards, I mean, they are rock solid. There's almost no give there. So both of them are trying to go for a similar thing there, but I gotta say, I feel like overall the parts quality inside the Yamaha is going to be to a slightly higher caliber than what you get on the Parasound, which uses more generic parts. But again, to balance everything out, the Parasound circuit is overall cleaner. It's simpler, which of course is a direct translation into the sound. Whereas the Yamaha, they're not going for the shortest signal path. Instead, they're going for a certain type of sound. And of course, that leads me to how they compare to one another in terms of raw performance. So you know what's funny? I just spoke at an incredibly rapid rate just to power through the last section, only to arrive here without too much more to say, because when you get right down to it, the difference between the Parasound Halo Hint 6 and the Yamaha A-S1200 is so stark that it doesn't actually take a whole lot of time to set the expectation as to what each brings to the table. So here's how it goes. The Yamaha A-S1200, comparatively, it is the more forward and energetic sounding integrated amplifier. The mid-range is more open, it sounds cleaner. The bass is also stronger, also sounds cleaner, and overall it has just a more powerful sound at the expense of having more of a distinct character that may be somewhat polarizing among listeners. Then we switch to the Parasound Halo Hint 6. By comparison, it is a warmer, more laid-back sounding unit. The mid-range in particular has a notable amount of more warmth, particularly the lower mid-range and upper bass. It's going to be slightly more balanced between the main frequency bands. It doesn't feature this bump that the Yamaha does, nor does it feature any dips. It's just an even-keeled going product. So they're very different in how they do things, and what you prefer is just going to boil down to personal taste. But I don't think one has an inherent advantage over the other in terms of overall raw performance. They're very good at what they do. It's just which one do you like? Anyways, guys, that's going to be my final take on the 1200. As always, thanks for tuning in, and until next time, peace.